Forget it, Arnie. This baby's got 93,000 miles on it. Probably 193.
For whatever reason, people always think about buying a car in the sense of you should never get a car with 100,000 miles. I guess they think that the car is going to spontaneously combust if it has 100,000 miles. I don't know what the that's about. But the truth is that cars have such a different portfolio in terms of what is wear and tear and what means a good car versus a bad car. And I really wanted to dispel that myth because I think that it's important for consumers to understand what mileage looks like and what you should think about when you buy your next car. I said I wasn't gonna really do car buying videos, but I lied. Anyway, stick around and stay tuned because you are now watching The Breakdown. In terms of the 100,000 miles, what is 100,000 miles? Well, 100,000 miles is usually the point where most people usually get rid of their cars or they're getting cars for dirt cheap. The reason behind this is because 100,000 miles typically represents the normal calculated wear and tear of a vehicle. In many cases, most people will have 100,000 miles on their cars in relatively less between 7 and 10 years, which would equate to anywhere between 8 and 10,000 miles per year. But a lot of people have this misunderstanding and this notion that 100,000 miles means that the car is basically going to break down. And the history of that really derives from a different place. So let's go ahead and take a whip on back into the historical records of the odometer and what that means for consumers in that time period versus today. So in terms of the 100,000 mile myth, it dates back to the early 20th century, back in 1903, with Charles and Arthur Warner as the first inventors of the odometer, and it was considered to be the odometer. I don't know, I've never heard of the odometer. I guess that's why it's called odometer, because it's odo, not auto. Boo! But it was supposed to be one of the more innovations in technology, because if you didn't know, around the time of 1886 and 1910 is really the true birth of the car, and so many different things were changing and so many different things were going, and ultimately the odometer, not the odometer, I cannot say this shit. But it really didn't become a true thing into cars until the 1970s. Now, during the 1970s, a digital odometer began to emerge on the market and quickly gained popularity because people loved the idea of digital, especially back in the 70s and 80s. You know, we was fascinated by computers. That AI is about to take our asses out, but that's besides the point. And by the 2000s, most digital odometers were standard into cars. One of the big things that people often forget, earlier time period versus the later time period, odometers only had 5 digits. As they grew to evolve, they began to have 6 digits. That also lets us know that manufacturers were aware of the improvements in technology, so we were able to go from 5 digits into 6. The interesting thing is, because of that 5-digit record, it kind of gave people the sense that their car was going to break down. Because of 5 digits, you could only go to 99,999, as opposed to 6-digit odometer, you could go to 199,999 miles. Now, I do want to go ahead and point out that the odometer is a little misleading. One of the big misconceptions about cars is that cars aren't built equally. For many American people, we oftentimes know that American cars are pretty cheap. Particularly in the 80s, many Americans oftentimes knew that American cars would not last beyond 100,000 miles, which is quite different between the American brands, the German brands, and the Japanese brands. A very, 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 very dangerous misconception that American cars, especially today, will hold that same thing, when in fact, most cars will last you up to 250,000 miles with proper maintenance. And that's kind of the point of this video, but we're not here yet. Japanese automotive manufacturers like Toyota and Honda have gained an emphasis over control quality and dedicated a lot of research and development to basically make their cars more durable. Toyota, for example, is notorious for building cars that are designed to last 30 years in a third world country. And Honda is more so focused on reliability and dependability because that's their bread and butter. Unlike the German manufacturers who make more performance-oriented cars, but their cars are also designed to last. It is very common for a Mercedes or a BMW with proper maintenance to get upwards of 300 and 400,000 miles, especially on the Autobahn. American cars, unfortunately, focus a lot more on value because they want to keep their cars more affordable, and the mileage for those particular cars, especially because they use cheaper quality materials, did not last as long as their Japanese and German counterparts. The world record with the most mileage is actually neither of those. It's actually Swedish brand Volvo, which has over 3 million miles, which is f***ing crazy, but I digress. And that brings me to my next point, which is reliability versus cost ratio. And as I said before, the Germans, they were really good about performance and building their stuff. The Japanese was like, oh, we can get you a cheap car that's gonna last you a long time. And the Americans really focused on value to cost. And the Americans were very aware that their cars did not last as long because they wanted you to come back and buy more. More importantly, they wanted to keep those cars affordable for the average consumer. Now, there is a point where when you look into buying a car, there is the reliability versus the cost ratio. Essentially, you have to determine whether or not the miles match the price. Because what happens is when people think of 100,000 miles, they don't understand there is a difference in highway miles versus city miles, as well as the type of engine and the type of maintenance that's been held on it. In many cases, according to Carfax, driving an average of 7,500 miles per year over 5 years can reduce the depreciation of a car by $1,000 compared to driving 15,000 miles. And that's because a used car's value hinges largely on how many unused miles it has left. And what that means in layman's terms is that they project this car will be salvageable by 250,000 miles. So the closer you get to that 250,000 mile mark, the more worthless the car actually is, which isn't necessarily true. In a lot of cases, you can have a car that's 1 year old and have 150,000 miles and have a car that has only 36,000 miles in less than 5 years. And to be honest with you, the car would still run just as well on a 250,000 mile car versus the 36, because it is the age of the car that breaks the car down more so than the actual miles, especially with proper maintenance. I'm gonna keep emphasizing that in case y'all didn't know. When it comes to buying a car in terms of the value to cost, that's something that you have to assess. Essentially, for every 200 city miles, that is the equivalent of 2,000 highway miles. And for whatever reason, when customers are thinking about buying a car, they always look at it as,
I don't want to put all of those miles on my car.
Well, guess what, Buttercup? That's what a car is supposed to do. It's supposed to be driven. In many cases, the more you drive a car, especially on a highway situation, it is more fuel efficient, it is having less stop and go, and those internal components aren't being worn as much as they could be. Brakes, tires, oil changes, all those different things are considered to be consumables. And so because of that, that doesn't necessarily hurt the car to keep those things changed. They're just gonna eventually go out. But when people look at 100,000 miles, they oftentimes take the advice of the old historical adage of the 5-digit odometer versus the 6. And that completely changes the value of the car. Now, as some level of advice, it is always a good idea to think about the age of the car versus the miles. I would always take a 3-year-old car with 150,000 miles that's severely depreciated versus a very high priced, low mileage car that's 20 years old, because you are going to have a much harder time trying to find those parts, getting it serviced, and the reliability is also diminished. One of the big things you can always do is to check the Carfax and make sure that the Carfax has accurate marks on it. The truth is, the Carfax is only as good as it is reported, and in a lot of cases, if they don't actually take it to the dealership doesn't get a chance to report it, which in turn gives a misleading understanding of what the Carfax is. And I say all that to say is to be very careful when looking at these reports. But the 100,000 mile myth continues to perpetuate an idea that it is a bad thing. And truth be told, the serviceability of a car does not really diminish as long as you properly take care of it. But the reason why it is such a big deal is because it heavily affects the price of the car. All 100,000 miles look completely different and is not something that you should stick to as Bible. The best way to do this is to check not just the brand of the car, but check the mileage of the car, but also check the model of the car and to check the records. The records have such a heavy emphasis on whether or not it is going to be a car that's going to give you a headache or it's going to be a car that's going to be absolutely promising. And ultimately, when you look at these things, it is always going to be a problem if you don't properly take care of the car. And the last thing that I want to talk about is that cars are insanely high. And at this point, 100,000 miles is kind of something you have to throw out the window. Cars in the last 12 years have gone up exponentially by at least 70% in cost, as well as the other costs of other things, including goods and needs, whatever. But cars, in a sense, have become so absorbently priced that the 100,000 mile myth really is irrelevant, because at this point, they're
all expensive.
There is no such thing as getting a car for a super discount because the supply has completely diminished. So if you're in the market for a car and you're unsure of how to buy it, right, here's 3 things that you can consider. The reliability of the car, which is basically how well is the car notoriously reliable. I've done another video about why the reliability doesn't matter, so you can go check that out if you want to. But the reliability is a huge component of whether or not a car is going to be good past 100,000 miles. And more importantly, the resale value is also a good idea, because it is going to be pretty much pointless if your car diminishes to damn near zero, even though it kind of contradicts what I just said, but whatever. And the environment in which the car was in, sometimes the snow, the dirt, the rain, the weather makes a huge difference in the reliability of a car, because it completely totals out the functionality of that car over the long haul. But I say all of these things to say is that the 100,000 mile myth really comes from the old 5-digit odometer and should not necessarily be considered when you're buying a car. With that being said, feel free to leave a comment below. Let me know if you would buy a car over 100,000 miles. That's less than 5 years. And I would love to hear your comments. With that being said, until the next episode, I'll see you guys later.